We'll start the webinar today by giving a brief introduction to ICLEI and ICLEI Africa and the work that we do across the globe. Then I will hand over to my colleague Sayuri Chetty, who will do an introduction to emissions inventories. And that overview will include what it is and what should be included in it, what information cities need to collect, the most common challenges from a city perspective and how to overcome them, and then the use of proxy data to fill in a greenhouse gas emissions inventory in the case that you don't have emissions data. We'll then hand over to two of our city colleagues who are here with us today from Nakuru County and Abuja. So we're really looking forward to hearing their experiences of building out a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And then we'll leave some time for questions and discussions where our hope is that you, our colleagues and cities can interact and participate directly with our presenters to ask any questions around the technical development of greenhouse gas emissions inventory, or to just engage with our cities and share your own experiences. The aim of this is we want to create a space for peer-to-peer and city-to-city learning. So please bear with us as we go through the presentation, and we'll get to the exciting bits towards the end. And apologies, my slide deck is very slow. So just a quick introduction. My name is Dania Petrick. I'm a senior specialist in resilience from ICLEI Africa, based in Cape Town, South Africa. I'm also the cities engagement manager for Cities Race to Resilience. Some of you might know me through that campaign. And my colleague Sayuri Chetty is a senior professional officer in the climate change, energy and resilience workstream at ICLEI Africa. And she has done a lot of work on the mitigation side of things. So who is ICLEI? ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, is a global network of over 2,500 local and subnational governments who are all committed to building sustainable urban development. As an organization, as a global organization, we are actively working in more than 125 countries and have been advocating for our local and subnational governments for over 30 years. We're not the oldest cities network in the space, but we are well established. And the work that we do, we always aim to support our leaders to find locally relevant sustainable solutions to incredibly complex and interrelated challenges. As you all know, climate change adds additional complexity to the immediate service delivery mandates that our cities are already under pressure to undertake and implement. So we know and recognize that our cities are first responders to climate impacts and representatives of the governments closest to our urban communities, and also civil servants actually to our constituencies. So at a subnational level, ICLEI drives change along 5 interconnected pathways that cut across sectors and jurisdictions. These are low emission development, nature-based solutions, equitable and people-centered development, resilient and circular development pathways. This design supports solutions to the climate crisis that can transform entire urban systems in a holistic way. ICLEI acts as the designated focal point of the local governments and municipal authorities constituency as well. And we have served as the voice of cities and regions across the globe since the very first Conference of the Parties in 1995. And we continue to achieve advocacy success for multi-level action in the climate, nature, and desertification process. I always battle with that word. So who is ICLEI Africa? We work across various development agendas across the African continent to align with both African and international policies, and we work within the realities of our continent. Essentially, we act as technical support to over 450 cities through different programs that aim to capacitate our local and subnational governments to deliver on and drive implementation for climate action. So that is across sectors, it's across water, it's across energy. And we even aim to act as an intermediary to support access to and mobilization of finance for implementation. So we've been working with African cities, large or small, remote or well-connected, no matter where they are on their sustainability journey for more than 2 decades. I am now going to hand over to my colleague, Sayuri Chetty, to present on the steps towards developing a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Sayuri, over to you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dania, and good morning to you all. Thanks for joining us today on this webinar. As introduced, my name is Sayuri Chetty, and I will be taking you through what is an emissions inventory, what information we need to have included in it, and what are the steps we need to follow as cities. So I think to begin, firstly, we need to understand as cities that the first step in our climate action planning is to, of course, identify and to measure where our emissions come from. And this is, of course, done by developing a greenhouse gas emissions, or for short, GHG inventory. So a GHG inventory is also known as carbon footprint assessment, and it's a quantified list of greenhouse gas emissions and emission sources. It is essentially a strategic tool for cities to understand, to manage, and to communicate their emissions resulting from their activities, and can be used as a basis for climate action planning and for reducing a city's carbon emissions. So essentially, this is what an emissions inventory is used for. It is the first step cities would need on their journey to climate action planning. And why is this important to measure? So we all know that climate change is the crisis of our time. Currently, the Earth is already at 1.1 degrees warmer than it was in the late 1800s, as you can see on the graph to my left. And emissions are continuing to rise at an alarming rate. So in order to keep global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees, as it is called for in the Paris Agreement, emissions need to be reduced by a whopping 45% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. So just also to clarify, net zero really means that all anthropogenic emission sources everywhere across the globe needs to be reduced to zero. So we have quite an ambitious task at hand. So if we also see that the context of cities and the importance they play, so over half of the world's population lives in cities, and this is likely to increase to over 2/3 by 2030. So cities are not only a population and an economic hub, but also they are a hub for greenhouse gas emissions. So cities use a large proportion of the world's energy supply and are responsible for around 70% of global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions, which of course then trap heat and result in the warming of the Earth. So as the saying goes, you cannot manage what you cannot measure. So essentially, cities need to develop greenhouse gas emission inventories for the following reasons. So if we stick to the next point, essentially it supports our evidence-based decision-making. It helps cities to conceptualize greenhouse gas emissions pathways. So understanding your emissions now can determine potential future pathways and also potential emissions reduction pathways specifically. It also provides the basis for monitoring change in emissions and also effectiveness of our action. And it is also often required for unlocking finance. So you'll find for a number of mitigation actions, this is an important step required by financiers. And so we think that this is quite a crucial step when embarking on a journey to finance various mitigation actions. So these are some of the different reasons. Greenhouse gas inventories are, of course, the starting point, for evidence-based decision-making. So if we look at the various principles when it comes to developing an emissions inventory, basically there are 5 main accounting and reporting principles that is recommended that we follow. The first, of course, is relevance, and this really relates to the reported greenhouse gas emissions appropriately reflected, also occurring due to the various activities and consumption patterns in the city. Relevance also refers to serving the needs and the decision-making needs, particularly of the city, as well as selecting the applicable data sources and determining and prioritizing which data you'd need to collect and include in your inventory. When it comes to completeness, the next one, cities shall account for all of the required emission sources within the inventory boundary, and any exclusions should be justified and clearly explained. Sorry, Dania, still on the last slide. So with the second principle, so that really relates to the completeness of data and any exclusions to be justified and clearly explained in the inventory. When it comes to consistency, this is using the same methodology, approaches, and boundary conditions when calculating your emissions and when putting together your inventory. This, of course, ensures that we can enable meaningful documentation of the emission changes over time, and also understand and see trends, and also ensure we can compare between cities. The next one is transparency. So this, of course, refers to your activity data, your emission sources, your emission factors, and the accounting methodologies you choose to employ. And of course, disclosure of any exclusions or any missing data, for example. So this all must be disclosed, identified, and justified so that any organization reading your inventory or is undergoing a verification process of your inventory can see all of this information upfront. So when it comes to accuracy, the next principle, your calculation of your greenhouse gas emissions should not be, of course, overstated or understated. It should be representative of your actual greenhouse gas emissions as far as possible. It should also be sufficient to give decision makers reasonable assurance of the integrity of the reported information. So lastly, when it comes, so that was the last principle. Of course, important to understand is that trade-offs may need to be required based on the particular city's objectives and needs. And we understand that data is, of course, sometimes difficult to obtain. So if we move to the next slide, so looking at the various steps for putting together an inventory. So if you are a city that is starting from scratch, you would need to first put together a baseline emissions inventory. And for this, you would need to choose a base year. So this could be 2015, for example. It doesn't necessarily have to be the present year. It's just a year that you would like to start putting together your inventory for, that you have data and have access to. So the next inventory could then use that as a baseline, and you compare against that baseline assessment. The next step, of course, is to define an inventory boundary. So this is, of course, a geographic boundary, which can be a ward, it can be an administrative boundary of your local government, it can be a community, for example. So that is completely up to you. The next step is to, of course, define your emission sources and then go about your collection of data. You would then need to calculate your greenhouse gas emissions for the various emission sources. And once you do this and you analyze your trends, you would be able to set targets to not only reduce your emissions, but also to set your progress against climate action. You can then report on voluntary reporting frameworks. And if we have time, we can touch on this a little bit later in the discussion session as well. But cities have the option to report their ambitions in terms of climate change and emissions reductions. And once you put together a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, this is the ideal basis to report from. You would then, of course, track and monitor your progress. And then, of course, depending on your progress, then see if your targets need to be adjusted or if your targets are still meeting the purposes of your climate ambitions. Lastly, you would then manage your inventory, and this could also include, developing an inventory management plan. So basically how to update the inventory as new data becomes available, the frequency, who to involve, and so forth. So if we move to the next slide, there is a protocol called the Community Scale Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory Protocol, for short, the GPC framework. And what this is that it is an internationally recognized accounting and reporting standards for cities. It has been developed by the World Resource Institute, C40 Cities, and of course, ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, and it's been tested by 35 cities. So this has been published initially in 2014 and updated in 2021. And this offers cities a robust, transparent, and consistent framework to identify, calculate, and report on their citywide greenhouse gas emissions. So this is available in English and in Spanish. And I know that it is also being translated into French at the moment. So this is quite an important tool for cities. On the CDP reporting platform, it was reported that almost half of the cities actually use the GPC to prepare their inventories. So this is something that is free for cities to use. It's easily accessible, easy to read, and we would highly recommend it to all cities to go through and work with in order to produce your inventory. So moving on to the next slide, looking at now what are some of the sources of the emissions to be included in your inventory. So when it comes to the recommended different sectors to be included in your inventory, this would be stationary energy, transportation, and waste. And just to mention, when we refer to stationary energy, this is usually referred to non-transport energy, energy from, of course, residential buildings, commercial, industrial, manufacturing, mining, storage, and so forth. So it's basically everything referring to non-transport energy. And of course, when it comes to your industrial processes and product use, as well as your agriculture, forestry, and other land use, this, of course, is not necessary to be included. However, it is recommended if these particular activities are quite significant in your boundary that you have chosen to represent your emissions inventory for. And if these, of course, are high emitting sectors, for example, and if you have access to data and the time and capacity to cover these two sectors. So moving on, now really looking at the different emission sources and the boundary of city emissions. So there is a classification of emissions which can be reported in your baseline emissions inventory according to where your activities are taking place and where emissions are released. So these groupings are referred to as scopes. So if you see the slide, there are 3 different scopes. The first scope refers to all of the emissions from sources located within the boundary of the city. For example, this is direct fuel use. However, there are a few other examples. So if you look at the picture on my right, you'll see that this also refers to in-boundary waste, wastewater, industrial processes, agriculture, and so forth. So when it comes to scope 2 emissions, this refers to greenhouse gas emissions from the use of grid supplied electricity, steam, heating, and cooling within the city boundary. And of course, your last scope is all other greenhouse gas emissions that occur outside of the city boundary as a result of activities within the city. So example, if you have a landfill, emissions when waste is generated inside the city, but your waste could be disposed outside of the city, for example. So I know this is a little bit, it may be a little bit difficult to grasp, and especially if you're hearing this for the first time, but I assure you that the GPC also has a really nice breakdown of what each of these scopes include and provides sufficient guidance on this. So moving on, if we go to our data collection, so just some indication of stats that you can use to include in your inventory. This can, of course, include population statistics, your electricity and your fuel sales, non-electricity use, such as households and how they consume firewood, charcoal, LPG, for example, waste data, so in terms of volume and how they are managed and treated. So that would include for municipal waste, organic waste, human waste, recyclable waste, and also any other waste that comes from industry, for example. So data also can be, of course, gathered from existing data sources. You could also generate new data or adapt data for your specific inventory use. And in general, it's good practice to start your data collection with an initial screening of available data sources that you can access. So moving on, if we look at some of the sectors and sources where you can collect your data from, some sources often include, so this is also various production and consumption data. So sources can include invoices from utility bills, for example, for electricity bought and sold, national and local census data to give you insights into population data and household usage. You could also undertake household surveys to understand fuel consumption, waste management, agricultural practices. You could also do surveys with industry and business. You could approach your National Department of Energy or your national or local distribution utilities for electricity and fuel sales and data associated with that. Your municipal buildings, you should have data on facility and fleet. Also your landfill sites, you also tap into national and local reports and statistics that come from there, as well as anything that's also found in the academic side, so university and research institute papers. There's often that you need to consult a wide range of data collection sources in case you do struggle to get primary data collection. So moving on, so we've covered data collection. Now just a very brief insight into calculating emissions. So of course, emissions can be calculated by hand, which is great for most of us who can quickly do this. And you don't need something sophisticated like an Excel spreadsheet to do it. But of course, you can utilize it if you set it up that way. But essentially, how you would calculate your emissions is you would use your activity data, which is basically data from the various activities that result in the emissions occurring within the city boundary, multiplied by your emissions factor, which is a conversion factor to convert the activity data into a mass of greenhouse gas emissions. And this is also published by the IPCC and is included in the GPC for your reference. And sometimes you also may need to include the global warming potential, which converts emissions into consistent units, sometimes into CO2 equivalent, which you would then need to report your emissions against. So all of this information is included in the GPC and by the IPCC. So this, you'll also have access to the slides, so you can also digest this in your own time. But maybe just moving on and very briefly touching on how you would calculate emissions, the equation is included for your reference. So moving on to some of the challenges when compiling an emissions inventory and how we can possibly overcome them. So I would like to invite you to also share some of these challenges that you have come across maybe when compiling your inventory. And of course, we'll also hear from two cities shortly about their specific experiences. So just very briefly touching on this, So in our experiences, we have seen that a main challenge is access to data, and of course, access to robust data, and also sometimes lack of trust when it comes to sharing data. And this can be, of course, a limiting factor to putting together an accurate greenhouse gas inventory. But what I'd also like to state is that it is important to know that you don't need to have a perfect inventory upfront. So it is important that you try and maybe triangulate data, you try and access maybe data that is important to the city. But if you cannot get data, there are also other sources which we will go into and other solutions you can tap into. But an emissions inventory doesn't have to be perfect for a city to act on their climate mitigation goals and also to reaching their targets. So that's just a caveat that I'd like to share with you. Next, of course, there's also, we know, sometimes limited capacities in cities and limited resources to compile an inventory, particularly also sometimes accounting for emissions for coal and fuel wood, especially at the household scale, can be challenging, especially because of fuel stacking. Then the value of doing an inventory is not always seen or not very clear. And there also may be conflicting or unclear mandates of different departments, which can pose some challenges. So if we move on to some of the potential solutions and some of the measures that some cities have employed to overcome some of these challenges. So our suggestion would be to really prioritize data that is, one, readily available, and two, that will lead to concrete actions or projects, and or you could also focus on the highest emitting sectors, or just focus on emissions within the city boundary. It is also advisable to conduct representative household surveys so that you get an accurate picture of the household sector. I know this is often quite challenging, but it is quite important to get a representative picture of what our households are consuming in terms of energy, agricultural practices, and so forth. Then another potential solution is, of course, to use proxy data or scaled data where possible. You could also use data and project it from different years. You could triangulate data from different sources. And we'll quickly touch on proxy data and scaled data and how that can be leveraged. But also another solution is to utilize resources and tools that are available for cities, especially those that do struggle with internal capacity. There's a number of resources and tools, and we've also linked this for useful afterwards. And lastly, we would also suggest that it's good practice to mobilize a cross-departmental task team within a city to work on your inventory so that you can leverage the various resources and align with the various mandates of different departments. It's also good to establish a data management protocol or a data desk and to really build a sense of a community. So you could create a community of practice to really build the trust that you need when it comes to sharing data and mainstreaming your climate change action. So if we move on to the last slide from my portion, we'll delve into very briefly how you can leverage proxy and scaled data. So we understand that data is not always available in the form and in the robustness that you need it to be. So one solution is, of course, utilizing proxy data or scaled data. And basically, this also includes using your national data or your regional or provincial and international data, which can then be, scaled down to then have a more of a representation on the local scale. So some examples of this include, you could use national fuel and electricity consumption, you could use regional waste and wastewater generation rates per capita, socioeconomic indices on the national scale, and you can basically downscale this using various factors, including your population, your GDP, and specific statistics, so that it can be downscaled to represent the subnational region that you need to. So that is it. that is it from my side. I now hand over back to Dania and looking forward to your questions in the discussion session. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Sayuri. And I know that we're a little bit tight on time, so I'm just going to run through this very quickly, but just to say that you are welcome to approach us about reporting to the CDP track, and we will always be available to answer any questions related to this. So the CDP ICLEI track helps cities and local governments report on their mitigation and adaptation activities, track progress, understand the impact, and take action. And it's really, really important to report and monitor on progress, specifically for the reasons of transparency and accountability, and also good governance. And I mean, we are seeing more and more that cities that are reporting to the CDP ICLEI track and other reporting platforms have enabled more conversations and discussions around climate finance and access to climate finance for implementation. It's not a guarantee, of course, but it is really good practice. So I won't go through this, Andrea. If we have time at the end, perhaps you can speak to the links to OPCC and some other campaigns like Race to Resilience, but I do want to speak to the benefits of reporting. So CDP ICLEI track is one single reporting system that covers all cities across the globe and multiple initiatives, like I mentioned, Race to Resilience, OPCC, etc. And it allows city to get a score and feedback from the technical help desk. And like I said, this supports transparency and good governance and improves investor confidence in your city. It also influences policy and decision making. It helps collect and store data, of course, and as we know, there's often turnover at the local level of our different representatives. So reporting annually to the CDP ICLEI track allows your city to have a repository of information to look back on and track progress moving forward. Of course, it also allows contributions to a 1.5 degree aligned, nature positive and equitable world where your actions for climate are showcased on a global platform. And then it also allows for insights and knowledge sharing with other cities in terms of what you're doing, what they're doing. A lot of the information, most of the information on the CDP ICLEI track is publicly available unless a city specifies that they don't want it to be available. So this does support knowledge sharing and peer-to-peer learning. And then it is a one-stop shop. It allows access to other environmental initiatives and services, like we've just seen. My colleague Sadie posted the link to the CDP GHG toolkits that cities can access, and it allows cities to fulfill GCOM requirements, for example. With that, I'm going to end off and I'm going to hand over to our cities to present. And first we'll have Ms. Grace Karanja, who is the Director of Environment and Climate Change at Nakuru County in Kenya. And her presentation will be followed by Ms. Abuja who is Special Advisor to the Honorable Chairman of Abuja Municipal Area Council. So without further ado, I hand over to our cities. Grace, are you on unmute? Are you able to speak, or shall we?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you really help me with projecting my presentation?
Yes, we've got it up.
Yes. Thank you very much. And for yes.
We're ready when you are.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity. First of all, my name is Grace, County Director, Environment and Climate Change, Nakuru County. Then Nakuru City and Nakuru is in Africa, Kenya, to be particular, and it falls under one of the 47 counties in the county. And I'm privileged to be here today to speak on greenhouse inventories which are happening. So next slide, please. Okay, to start with the outline of what I'm going to present, we talked about the obstacles that we have been able to overcome in the process. Also, the data that we use in building up the greenhouse emission inventory, and the sectors that were included in collecting that very informative data, and the reason as to why we had to have that inventory. Then we'll go into the lessons learned, and of course, what will be the recommendations on us moving further.
Grace, are you able to hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. We are on your next slide on challenges that Nakuru has overcome.
Yes. Thank you for this. And for one, we have been able to have a lot of information in regards as we are developing our third generation CIDP, where this information come in handy. Of course, our baseline was subjected from the year 2019 January, and the scope was from 2019 January to December 2019. So with the coming now of the new era, where we have to develop our 5-year plan, this information came in here handy because we are able to mainstream the actions that we are able to identify in that process. Then as a result of that, we also have Nakuru County Climate Change Fund Regulation, whereby after we did the baseline inventory, there are various challenges that we needed to tackle in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And we needed to have the finances to be able to cater for those activities. And here we are able now to convince and have a climate change fund regulation, which gives the power or the right to have a specific fund to tackle climate action. Also, we have Nakuru County Climate Change Act, which is stipulated that we should have an establishment maybe of climate change units that specifically take care of climate change issues and data for that matter. Then we are so privileged because even this baseline inventory came as a result of developing the Sustainable Energy Action Plan, Access and Climate Action Plan, which we are privileged to be assisted by ICLEI. And that's why we are here today. We also, on the same data, we were able to develop Nakuru County Clean Energy policy and also Nakuru County Energy Plan. So on the same line, because we had to tackle various sectors, that is agriculture, stationary energy, and waste. In the county, we also have the Nakuru County Urban Agriculture Promotion and Regulation as part of the mitigation and adaptation measures identified as one of the emitters or emissions that are generated from agricultural related activities. Then we have a Nakuru County Agriculture Training and Mechanization Act that also help us to ensure that we mitigate against issues of climate change through reduced emission in our processes as a result of agricultural mechanization. Next, please. Okay, on the data that we were able to use we were able to use the data emanating from agricultural practices, the forestry aspect, other land use activities. And this one also we have to do with in-boundary waste and wastewater, because we have to have an integrated waste management. Then stationary energy in terms of fuel combustion, the industrial processes and produce use, then in boundary transportation. And with that, you will see in the next slide that most of the sectors that we are able to utilize so that we can have this baseline were derived from the very one that we saw emitting a lot of greenhouse emissions, and they were derived from the waste as a result of us as a city. We are quite a huge amount of waste, but how are we managing that waste to reduce the emissions, that is methane? Agricultural practices, they are also part of activities that are done in Nakuru. They are more of agricultural oriented, and they, to some extent, especially in the livestock, they usually generate a lot of greenhouse emissions. So go to the previous slide. So according to the results of what we were able to manage in the national emission, that is 2010, when considering only emissions from energy and others, including transport and waste sectors, where we were generating as a country 17 million tons of CO2, which equates to 0.4 tons of CO2 per capita in the Republic of Kenya, according to the report of 2015. Nakuru alone, according to the 2019 GHG inventory, it equates that we generate 0.8 tons of CO2 per capita. The global average is estimated at 4.8%. Then with that one, we are talking of generating a total amount of 16,442 tons of greenhouse. That is, we say commingled greenhouse just from different sectors. And that one is translating to, like, for example, as is Nakuru having to transport, to move from Nakuru to Nairobi, that's quite a distance. That having around that 7,000 cars traveling from Nakuru city center to Nairobi every day and back. That is a huge amount that we are generating. I would like to come down to zero if possible, so that we can be able to have a climate neutral city and also contribute to the national determined contribution of our country. Next. So these are the results as I was alluding earlier. On stationary energy, we targeted the residential buildings, commercial and institutional buildings. We also targeted the manufacturing industries and construction. Then energy industries, energy generating supplies. And on that, Nakuru County is one of the, it is the greatest generators of green energy that is grabbed from geothermal. So when we talk of energy developing company, that's what we meant. And pesticide sources that you cannot be able to track where they come from. Then emissions from mining, processing, and then fugitive emission from oil and natural gas systems. So in these sectors, as I had said earlier, we are talking of total emission of having 1,642, 1,642,867 tons of CO2 emitted into within that year. So,
Grace,
and with the three sectors, yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. Are you able to wrap up in the next minute so we have time to hear from Abuja?
Sorry?
Are you able to wrap up your presentation?
Yes, I will wrap up right now.
Okay, great.
So you can move to the next one, So what are the solutions? In the solution, according to our plans, we are talking of promoting better uses of energy, like for example, having non-motorized transport in our city. That will reduce more cars coming into the city, and also just designating specific parking areas or the areas that motorized can be. You also have to do energy audit and establish a waste recovery center. This one will assist in harnessing the methane gas or any other gas that's coming out to add value to it, that we can have reduced emissions from these processes. Next, please. So why do we have to have this? It will help us in decision making. It will also guide us in the areas of legal frameworks and policies. It will also assist the nation in the proper financing, and also it helps us building climate resilience and also adaptation to our people, and also providing the best alternative for us to be able to have a low carbon emission processes. Next. So the lessons learned is that since we did not have the inventory, it was very difficult to have the data on cost. But at least like now we have a baseline where we can be able now to utilize the same data and also bring in more. We had an opportunity also to learn what we did not have. And also we were able now to look for finances where we can be able to utilize it and then feed into more climate smart projects. So with this inventory, the county can make a proper decisions in terms of planning and also in terms of financing climatic local-led initiatives. Then next, and thank you very much. And I'm proud to be part of this webinar.
Thank you so much, Grace, and fantastic to hear from you and your experience and the different solutions and challenges that you've overcome. Without any more time, I am going to hand directly over to Ms. Abuja Municipal. Are you online from Abuja?
Oh, good morning.
Morning.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I may not be able to share my video so that I can have a smooth internet.
No worries. We've got your presentation up, Ms. Esiet. Go for it.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll be talking from the perspective of political will and political leadership and policies, and also in the greenhouse emission and our experience getting this data. So Abuja City, and first let me thank ICLEI, let me thank the EU, let me thank GIZ for the opportunity and the support to empower Abuja to be able to carry out this through our sustainable energy access and climate action plan. And it was through this platform we're able to have a background data about our greenhouse emission inventory and other things. So a little background about Abuja City so that you understand the structural nature of the city. So Abuja City is Abuja is the capital of Nigeria, and Abuja City is the city of Abuja, which is the capital. And you have the federal government's agency domicile within the city. You have the presidency domicile within the city. You have the members of parliament domicile within the city, and you have this small local government. So before we're able to do the inventory, we had the issue about communication gap between the federal agency and also the local city about issues about data. We're not able to get enough data about our greenhouse emission inventory and greenhouse gas, a lot of things that we needed data for. There were no communication. And as Abuja, as a city within the capital city, every policy passed. So we have national policy on climate action at the national level. We have plans at the national level on renewable energy for Nigeria. So all this policy, as it's been passed at the national level, it automatically applies to the city because we are within the capital city. So all the policies and laws at national level applies to us. We don't have to form our home policies. We just have to apply the same policies. So before now, there were, communication back between the federal agency, Federal Ministry of Environment and Climate Action, and also the municipal. But the SECA brought about all the necessary stakeholders from the different levels, tiers of government to come together to help the local city develop its action plan and also get the necessary data for it. So we can move to the next slide. So this is just a summary of our baseline emission inventory that we discovered based on our research and also based on desk review and also from information gathered from the different ministries working together on this aspect of the climate change. So we had, like our previous speakers have said, the findings is based on 3 categories: the waste, the stationary energy, and also the transportation. For the waste, we had 18%, and this is just the baseline we discover. And also for the stationary energy, 53%, and transportation took about 29%. And we can see that, the total emission that we have about 3 million plus, and 1.3% of Nigeria emission saying the equivalent of 54 cars that is driving within the city, out of the city on a daily basis. And we have 2.2 tons CO2 emission per person within the city. So next slide. So we'll now explain, before this, yes. So our vision was to mitigate others as a municipal is to reduce greenhouse gas emission by 25% compared to the baseline as usual that you have seen, with clean environment, a sustainable energy supply, efficient transport system, integrated waste management in line with the global best practice. That's our vision. The next slide. So target for our mitigation pillar was to reduce emission by 30% by 2030 as compared to BAU. And also our transport to reduce emission by 20% as compared to BAU. I will also talk about some of the activities to address all this target. And the waste is also to reduce waste by 20% by 2023 compared to this. So for the stationary energy, we plan installing 7 mini grids with total capacity of 2 megawatts and 1,000 solar home system per person, just to address the stationary, to help us achieve the stationary energy target. We also plan to distribute about 5,000 cooking stoves to rural communities. For, in the process of developing our database and also developing this target, we make sure that all necessary stakeholders from members of the community, rural women, indigenous women, traditional leaders within the communities of Abuja City were brought on board to also be part of this. So it was a joint, as a local city, it was a joint agreement by members of the community and necessary stakeholders, including our federal government agency, to agree on these terms and work together to achieve this. That's an important aspect of our pillar and our action plan. So on transportation, our plan was to upgrade public transportation infrastructure to operationalize bus public transport routes and include bicycle lanes. So we have a plan to working with our sister agency, which is a state agency, to have a dedicated route to public transport buses, BRT. So whereby, it will help people who want to get to work faster, will be able to get to work faster, and they don't have to use their car. And they will prefer to use the public transport because, there is a dedicated lane on the expressway that links from the suburb to the town, and it's easier for them to get to town, but, not minding, which encourages them to use the bus and not using their car because they will get to town in ample of times, unlike using their car when they will spend hours on the road, bringing out CO2 and all that, and they are stuck on the road because of traffic. And that was the idea for the transportation. So on the waste, we plan organizing awareness raising campaign to sensitize the population to reduce, reuse, and recycle of waste. And we're also doing this with our sister agency to educate people and create awareness about how to maximize their waste, and also planning a recycling plant within the municipal cities, also with the support of other agencies. So on implementing waste to wealth program, it's also for the 3 wards within the council. We also plan to implement waste to wealth, work with other stakeholders who pick waste, some of the informal waste pickers, to work with them, sensitize them, train them about this, bring in your waste, we also give them some financial returns for that. So that's our plan for the 3 levels of priority action for our mitigation pillar to address the baseline inventory that we got from the greenhouse emission. Next slide, I think. Yes. So I think that's hand for our inventory and also our plan. But most important thing is to, backing up our findings with political will and commitment. So for us at the municipal, we actually incorporated some of this action into our yearly budget so that we could have a political will to back up what we have done, because the mayor was in support of the inventory. We had carried him along. He was in support and he committed to it by making sure a percentage of the income coming from the council is also dedicated towards implementing some of this action plan. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much to our cities for your presentation and for sharing. We unfortunately are out of time, but if there are any burning questions, let's open to the floor now for the next 2 minutes. And specifically, if you have questions for our cities, please raise them now. You can just put your hand up and we'll give you this opportunity to discuss. I know Sayuri has been answering questions in the chat, but if there are any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and we can have them online. Nothing? Okay, then Andrea, I'm going to hand over to you to close, but thank you everyone. Thank you especially to our 2 cities here today. We really appreciate your experience and your sharing, and we hope that there are some amazing lessons for other participants here.
Thank you so much, Dani, and to Sayuri, to our city guests. It's so interesting to see how you've been dealing with the emissions inventories, as it's mentioned that it's a very critical and vital part of cities' work. So just a big thank you again to ICLEI for being with us. And I will just invite the cities, just a reminder that the One Planet City Challenge is open. And as Dania mentioned, you can participate, you can join on it in the CDP ICLEI track. So it is very simple. You just have to click that you want to participate in the One Planet City Challenge and then answer the questions that you normally answer to a report. And yeah, we are very happy to have had you here. Thank you so much. I hope you have a lovely summer if we don't see each other before this. And yeah, big applause and thanks again for everyone, all of our speakers today.